Hi, I'm Molly Barnes. My guest today I'm honored to have is Hunter Drohojowska. She's one of the best writers working in this country today. She writes for the Los Angeles Times. She writes for Architectural Digest. She's the West Coast editor of Art News. And she's just recently written a book about Georgia O'Keeffe called Full Bloom, The Art and Life of Georgia O'Keeffe. Welcome, Hunter.
Thank you, Molly. It's good to be here.
Thank you. How did the book come about?
Well, I actually wrote an obituary of O'Keeffe for Art News magazine way back in 1987, 88. And based on the research I did for her obituary, which was long, kind of a long feature piece, I found that there was only one, at the time, one biography of the artist, and she was such a major figure. And that biography was very slim. So I thought, well, now that she's deceased, it's time to do a big biography. And 14 years later, here I am.
I can't believe it. It all came from doing obit. I should actually put the book up because it's beautiful. And I've enjoyed reading it. I reread today parts of it, and I realized that you had said that she was really the greatest woman painter in this country for many years. Do you still feel that?
Well, in the 20th century, she was the most successful woman artist in America, well, in the world. She was the most successful woman artist through the 20th century. There's no doubt about that, really.
Oh, whoops.
There she goes. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Maybe I should say the first half of the 20th century, because at the end of the 20th century, we get into some pretty major women artists. But I think she certainly stands as a role model for many women who...
For example?
Well, if not in style, particularly in her drive and her ambition. The one thing that was great about Georgia O'Keeffe is that she had such a sense of competitiveness and ambition. I mean, she wanted to win. There were plenty of women artists working at the same time, and but I'm not sure they understood how challenging and competitive the art world really could be. And of course, because Georgia was married to Alfred Stieglitz, she knew exactly how competitive it should be.
Well, tell me about her early days. Didn't she grow up in Wisconsin on a farm?
Yes,
sort of an
she was a farm
family?
Farm girl. She always said it was a happy family, but it was certainly a happy family that lost much of its financial support and
what did her
comfort.
father do? She looks exactly like her father.
Her father, yes, she was that dark Irish genetic with the dark hair and the light eyes and the pale skin, and I think maybe a more Hungarian bone structure. But she grew up on this farm, and it was very idyllic until they sold the farm and moved to Virginia, and then they lost a lot of their income through one thing and another, and suddenly she was forced to go to work. I mean, she'd been going to the Art Institute. I think she'd been raised to believe there would always be some sort of financial backing for her from her family. And suddenly that was not the case. So she had to reconsider what she would do, and she decided to become an art teacher. And so she dutifully went to school to do that. And along the way, she went down, began doing these radical abstract paintings while she was teaching down south one
Carolina.
summer, right? And
yeah.
The next thing we know, those drawings get shown to Alfred Stieglitz, who's the most famous person in the art world at that time, and he has discovered her. And
he had Gallery 291,
he
which
had
is the address
291
on Lexington Avenue.
On Fifth Avenue, and he was just the most important person in this country. He was the first in America to show Cézanne and to show Picasso, and he was sort of at the end of his role at 291 in a way. It had been open for many years. He was the first to introduce Rodin to this country. But he was looking for a woman artist to represent.
Really?
And in that time, it wasn't really that easy to find anyone working in such a radical, abstract manner. I mean, this is 1914, 1915 when she's doing these drawings. And so they are, he shows the drawings without really knowing her. I mean, he didn't do them because he was fond of her. No.
Yeah.
But then she, the following year, goes to New York for her next show, and she meets him. And in the meantime, they've had a lot of correspondence and got to know each other quite well through their letters to one another. However, Stieglitz has been married for 25 years to the same woman, Emmy Stieglitz. He has an adult daughter.
You say they were not happy in their marriage.
Emmy and Alfred Stieglitz were not happy in their marriage, or at least he was not happy. I think she probably was happy, but she was never able to sort of make him into sort of the more conventional, socially acceptable husband that she sort of hoped he would be. And he and Emmy hadn't had really a strong romantic relationship for many years. So here he meets this much younger, very attractive, radical young artist, Georgia O'Keeffe, and he is immediately smitten by her and pursues her, although not in a very direct way, as you read in my book. It's it's not exactly a direct courtship because he knows he's really not supposed to be having any courtship at all. He's married.
Some of the artists that were in his gallery, John Marin, who were some of the others?
Arthur Dove, Marston Hartley, and those were and Charles and Demuth later.
Charles Demuth, and then you talked about a Dow who was a big influence on her. Is that correct?
Well, when she was studying, she came under the influence of Arthur Wesley Dow, first at the University of Virginia, where she began studying, and then she went to study with him directly at Columbia University in New York when she was studying to become a teacher. And he was the one who introduced her to the idea of using decoration and arranging forms in a way that to create kind of a beautiful pattern and to free her from the idea of having to represent the world in an exact way. He really freed her from a lot of expectations. And curiously enough, since this show is aired in Los Angeles, I want to add that I was reading recently that Nelbert Chouinard, who started Chouinard Art Institute here in Los Angeles, also studied with Arthur Wesley Dow, and also is credited by many of her students with passing on Dow's message to people like Millard Sheets. So Dow's teachings were really widespread, and his students were mostly women. And they were women who wanted to be professional artists, as indeed Nelbert Chouinard wanted to be. But most of them couldn't have careers as artists because of the times, so most of them wound up teaching. And so Dow's theories were widely spread throughout this country.
What do you think his biggest contribution was in terms of ideas, spiritual ideas?
Well, not necessarily spiritual ideas, but he did believe that that by not working in a representational mode, one might be able to get closer to sort of pure consciousness that could come through in the work somehow.
One of the things that I noticed rereading your book was the idea of she magnified things, everyday objects, things like flowers, and made them much larger, juxtaposed to very small things. So suddenly there's a mysticism that you're not aware of until you see them.
Well, that idea comes from Paul Strand, and she before she gets involved with Stieglitz, she's very much attracted to the photographer Paul Strand, who also shows in Stieglitz's gallery, and who is more or less her age. And they have a passionate attraction to one another, and he sends her many of his photographs of objects that are blown up and magnified, chairs and bowls, inanimate things that were then turned into abstractions in a way just because they were made so much larger than they were in real life, or shown at a different angle. And she understood the importance of this magnification, and she took that idea and she applied it to her painting. And so that's where we eventually would get the paintings for which she's best known, the magnified flowers, where you have a flower that's now 4 by 5 feet. Or 3 by 4 feet, so you're really seeing it up close, and it loses its quality of being sort of a decorative little flower and becomes something much grander and more dramatic.
This is one of the styles that's the most copied, is painters doing the huge flowers, trying to evoke an emotion such as what she did.
Absolutely, and she always said that she just thought it was a way of getting people to pay attention to a flower, that they might not pay attention to its details any other way. But of course, they also have great symbolic resonance.
Do you think she realized how sexual the paintings were?
I think she realized how sexual the paintings were, and she thought it was, and she never admitted to it, because that would be giving in. She was a great prankster, and she really wasn't that yet. She had a great sense of humor, a little dry sense of humor, her own sense of humor. And she was very interested in doing things her way. And so this would be her little joke. I mean, they're frankly sexual paintings, and we know from the letters she was exchanging with Alfred Stieglitz that their sexual relationship was extremely passionate. And they discussed their sexual relations with one another in these letters. And he specifically refers to paintings like Black Iris as reminding him of her.
How interesting. I remember living at the Shelton Hotel at one time, and she, if it's true, had lived there with Stieglitz and actually had an art show for herself over a long weekend, trying to decide how to paint, what size to paint, and eliminating anything that didn't have to do directly with a continuity of the other paintings.
That story is true, but I think it happens earlier. I think it happens when she's still in the South, in South Carolina, where she gives herself a little art show and she eliminates a lot of her old, more traditional work and decides to make a commitment to her abstract charcoals, because she doesn't actually move into the Shelton, I think, until the mid-20s. But it doesn't mean she wouldn't have done it again. She was always interested in editing and culling and getting rid of her work. And as late as the 1950s, she got rid of, quite a lot of canvases she didn't think made the grade.
I love the painting that you have in the book, Shelton Hotel with Sunspot. I think it's just amazing. Was that something wrong with her eye, or was that an intentional sunspot?
Well, we think it's because she was looking at photographs. She had looked at photographs of the Shelton Hotel, and we think that I saw that painting recently at the Art Institute of Chicago, and I looked at it again with an eye of having looked at these kinds of works in reproduction for many years, and I'd seen it before, but I looked at it very carefully, and I think it's true that she would look at a photograph of something like that, and then she would take liberties. Because when you look at the actual painting, and in fact all of her paintings are much more painterly in person than they are in reproduction, although they reproduce as though they're very clean and graphic. They don't look that painted when you see them in reproduction, but actually her technique was much more subtle than you really can tell just by looking at the pictures in books or magazines.
Tell me about Lake George. They would spend their summers there with his family.
They would, and I think initially that was a relief to her to go up and be spending time in this beautiful country estate on the water and have a lot of people around. All these famous artists and critics and musicians would come up and spend the summer, and after a few years of that, though, I think it became quite tiring. For one thing, she really was very much. Eventually, she married Stieglitz in 1924 after he divorced Emmy, or was able to get a divorce from Emmy. But she was very much also his wife. I mean, although she was very independent and she was able to pursue her career, she was also in charge of making sure the household ran properly. And she did have help, but they still had to have food, and they had to clean, and they had to cook. And if you have all those people there, she would be slightly in charge of that. And when they went to Lake George for the summer, they packed everything and took it up with them on the train. They didn't have it, it didn't stay in the house all summer. So they packed up all the dishes and the furniture and the paint supplies and the clothes, and up they went on the train from Manhattan to Lake George, and she was in charge of all that.
In the book, you've actually suggested that she had difficulty in the marriage because of her own desire to be. Don't you're happily married, I'm happily married, but don't you find that it is sort of a pull all the time, trying to think, oh my God, what do I have to do for the family, when you want to get to your work, you want to be left alone?
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of other women artists relate to her. I mean, she really had that challenge of wanting to get her work done and yet also having to be responsible to Stieglitz. And of course, I think that's why she was so angry, in part, when Stieglitz has an affair with Dorothy Norman. Dorothy
Norman, now you mentioned that you've interviewed her a number of times.
I did. She was quite elderly, in her 80s when I interviewed her. Stieglitz had passed away, and O'Keeffe had passed away. Well, Stieglitz had passed away in 1946, and O'Keeffe died in 1987. So after that, I was able to interview Dorothy Norman, who was a beautiful young socialite with whom Stieglitz took up really around 1926, 27, when O'Keeffe was really at the height of her career. And I think she very much felt as though she had worked really hard to become the great artist that he'd wanted her to become, and she was painting and really getting a lot of attention and a lot of shows and selling a lot of work. And at that very moment, he decides to take up with a much more compliant and devoted 21-year-old woman who herself is married to another man, but still she was devoted to Stieglitz.
Did she divorce her husband, or did she?
She did, but not for many, many years. Dorothy Norman and Alfred Stieglitz had an affair that continued really till the end of his life, and that relationship was extremely painful to O'Keeffe. I think because what we were saying, I think she felt like she had been a devoted wife to Alfred Stieglitz as well, and he had been certainly terribly important to her career. There's no doubt that without his support and his promotional skills, she might have been tremendously talented, but she could not have had the career that she had without him.
When you marry your mistress, I understand there's always another job open.
Exactly.
What led her to move to the Southwest?
Well, I think that the embarrassment of this ongoing love affair that her husband was having with Dorothy Norman, they were both, he was very high profile as a figure in New York City, and actually Dorothy Norman and her husband Edward were high profile social figures in New York City, and everyone in New York's small art world knew that Alfred was carrying on with Dorothy, and Georgia was very embarrassed, and she tried, that prompted her first trip to New Mexico, and then they kept trying to work it out, and Alfred would not give Dorothy up. So it prompted her to go on to Maine, and it prompted her to go take small trips until she finally had a nervous breakdown, was hospitalized, and then after that began spending more and more longer periods of time in the Southwest, where she
was such a sensual painter. Was she a lesbian? Was that ever an issue?
No, she was not a lesbian, and I'm not quite sure where that rumor comes from, but because she had an assistant late in life named Maria Chabot, who was a lesbian and who lived with her out in the Southwest, I think that might have prompted some of those rumors. But the correspondence between O'Keeffe and Maria Chabot makes it absolutely clear that although Maria Chabot might have been in love with Georgia O'Keeffe had no interest in Maria on that level whatsoever, or any woman, in fact.
Tell me what you're doing now. Are you working on another book?
I am. I'm working on a book on Los Angeles and the art scene of the 1960s, and how it comes together really quite rather abruptly, as it were, that in the 1950s there are a handful of galleries and artists sort of poking along, and good artists making good work, and then suddenly in the 60s we have the Ferris Gallery and the Dwan Gallery and many other, Ralph Nelson Gallery, and they all kind of come up at once, and we have the LA County Museum of Art opens, and Art Forum moves here, and it's just a very exciting time, and a lot of very important contemporary artists come out of that period, and many of those artists have great international careers today, like Ed Ruscha or David Hockney or John Baldessari, who you showed at your gallery.
You know, it's funny, I worked for Rolf Nelson in the 60s as his assistant, and he had kind of an iffy reputation, like one buzz from me would be VIP, two buzzes would be FBI. But he had an amazing style. He was all over the board. It was not one style, it was not abstract expressionist, it was not pop art. But he had that George O'Keeffe that you have in your book, Above the Clouds. And it was 75 feet long, and it was just an amazing painting. And I sat with it so long, and seeing the picture in your book today, I was reminded of it, because it changed my whole way of looking at things. I went to Hawaii with my family after sitting in that gallery looking at that painting for months, and everything related back in my visual thinking to the painting. We would be at some place in Hawaii, and suddenly I could see her the way she'd seen it. And I think that's what an artist does. An important artist can change your perception. You see things very differently.
Well, also she was elderly when she painted that. I think she was in her 70s, and she was
78.
78.
You said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And she had to help someone make the stretcher bars and stretch the canvas in her garage, and she worked on it for months and months and months. But she was responding to Barnett Newman, Ellsworth Kelly. She was responding to the artists who had come up in the 50s and 60s with these monumental canvases, and Frank Stella even, and the way in which they were addressing scale on the canvas, so she was that competitive and that ambitious and that aware well into her career, so that instead of saying, well, I don't do that, that's not my generation, that's not my scene, she thought, that's a good idea, let's try to work on their level and see if it's possible. She tried it. She did 3 of those big paintings.
It's amazing that she, as a woman, could become so successful. Did people like Ellsworth Kelly pay homage to her?
Yes, and she paid homage to Ellsworth Kelly. She didn't like that many contemporary artists, but she always said, she liked Ellsworth Kelly and once said that she had seen a few of his things and thought they might be hers.
The drawings, the drawings of the flowers.
Some of the abstract paintings. Her latest work is really quite abstract and quite minimal, and I think she thought he had a sense of scale and color that was similar to hers, and I could see that.
If you could own one George O'Keeffe, what would it be?
Oh, I think, God, that's a terrible question. I do love the Shelton with Sunspots. It's always been one of my favorite ones. And I also love Black Iris. And I love some of the really abstract ones at the beginning of her career, like the Music Blue and Green or Music Pink and Blue.
You've got that very loose watercolor, the red, and I think that that's a favorite of mine too. What about the Black Cross?
The Black Cross is fantastic, and I love that she did that the first summer she went to New Mexico and stayed in Taos and with Mabel Dodge Lujan, and I think that it's such an extraordinarily dramatic painting and such a departure from what she'd been doing right before that you just see that she's an artist who responds immediately and genuinely to what was around her. And
one more bit of gossip I want to know about. Did you ever know Juan Hamilton or Dan Butnick, who were extremely attractive men who spent a great deal of time with her toward the end of her life?
I know both of them, and I interviewed both of them.
Well, who was your favorite?
They're both darling, and Juan was very generous with his time at the beginning of this book and gave me a lot of information that was very helpful in terms of his insights and in terms of working with her and what it was like to work for her and so forth.
Well, Dan Butnick is a great friend of mine, did the cover, the de Kooning, the bicycle book that Robert Long wrote, but he is having a show at Nerdler in New York in January, and I just think he's an amazing photographer. He was there at the right time.
He absolutely was, and he knows a lot about the Southwest.
What do you think the art scene is like today in Los Angeles, and how does it compare to New York?
Well, it's sort of still, I think, apples and oranges. To use I guess the New York group would be the apples and we'll be the oranges. I think that the production here is as good as anywhere in the world, and I think that what's happened, interestingly, is that it's no longer LA versus New York. It's LA has gained such an international reputation. It's as though LA exists independently with its own relationship to all the European galleries and European dealers, and I think is taken just as seriously now as New York. It doesn't have as many galleries. It has a lot of galleries, but not so many. And so I just think they're sort of different. I definitely think the marketplace in New York is stronger. The publishing of art magazines in New York is stronger, but the art made in LA is just as strong.
How do you like writing for ArtNet?
I think Walter Robinson's done a wonderful job editing ArtNet. He seems to always have interesting stories, criticism, reviews, gossip. He really seems to be able to corral the right mix of things that seems very of the moment to me, a little bit beyond what we think of as happening in the traditional art magazine.
When you write for Art News, how do you pick the artists you're going to write about, the shows you're going to cover?
Well, sometimes I pick them, and sometimes they'll call me and ask me to review a show. I just reviewed that show of called Translucence. It's a show of the light and space artists at the Norton Simon Museum.
What did you think?
Because they asked me to do it, and I was glad they did because it gave me time to think about it and write something very small, but I wrote something anyway.
But what did you think of the show?
I think that stuff looks really amazing now that time, in a way, it looks so fresh.
Some of the people that were in the show, Larry Bell,
Dwayne Valentine,
Laddie.
There is
Peter
a piece by
Alexander.
Laddie John Dill. There's a Peter. Yeah, that's exactly
Bob
right.
Irwin.
Yep, absolutely.
Norman Zammit. I just thought it was amazing. Everything was cleaned up and looked really, really beautiful, and it was beautifully lit.
And Helen Pashkin, who they borrowed, I guess, for that show, but who looked so lively, and I thought it was nice that the curator reached out and chose a woman artist who isn't normally associated with that group, but gave her due. I mean, she was there doing that work, and instead of just carrying on and assuming she, not paying attention to a woman who was working at that time, to actually include her in the show in a kind of revisionist but completely accurate way.
My last question is, when did you decide you wanted to be an art writer?
I wish I'd become an art dealer.
Do you really?
No.
There's such a trick to that. I don't, I can, oh.
It's very, I know, it's a really hard thing to do. As being an art writer, I'm an artist. I'm an artist.
Yeah, that's how I feel about myself, too.
Well, I trained as an artist. I went to art school.
Where?
And I found out that I was, a few different places, but I basically found out that I am better at writing about art than making art. And I am just somewhere along the way realized that I was a writer, but a writer very interested in the visual world. So I was able to mix my two loves, my writing and the visual world.
Get this book. It is really amazing. You learn a great deal about art history in this century. My name is Molly Barnes. I want to thank you, Hunter Drohojowska, for coming. Art is not for everyone. It never has been. It never will be. But for those of you who love it like we do, we want to turn you on. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.